The village of Black River sits where the water runs slow and dark, under a covered bridge nobody's bothered to fix in 30 years. And the man they called its saint was found dead in the boathouse behind his own charity hall, with his shoes still dry. That detail bothered me before I even knew his name. Elias Corbin had built the Black River Benevolent Trust out of nothing but a school teacher's salary and a knack for making rich men feel guilty at dinner parties. And in 20 years, he'd turned a dying mill town into something that almost looked like it had a future. Roofs got fixed. Kids got scholarships. Old widows got their heating oil paid without ever knowing who'd paid it. The man was, by every account I could gather, standing in that boathouse with my hat still on, close to a local god. Gods don't usually die with a fishing line wrapped twice around their throat. The county coroner's assistant, a nervous kid named Petrie, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, told me the working theory before I'd even asked. Robbery gone wrong, maybe a drifter, maybe somebody who didn't know who they were tangling with. It was a tidy little theory. It also ignored 3 things sitting right there in that boathouse that nobody wanted to explain. First, a ledger, waterlogged and dried stiff, its pages fused together except for one, torn clean out, leaving only the stub and a column of numbers that stopped mid-sum. Second, a single white glove, small enough for a woman's hand, tucked with almost tender care into the inside pocket of Corbin's coat, monogrammed, initials that meant nothing to anyone I asked that afternoon. Third, and this was the one that stuck in my throat, a chess piece. The White Queen, clenched so tight in the dead man's right fist that Petrie had to pry the fingers back one at a time to get it loose. There wasn't a chessboard anywhere in that boathouse, or in Corbin's tidy little cottage up the hill, or anywhere in Black River that anyone could point to. A saint, a torn ledger, a stranger's glove, and a queen with no board to belong to. I stood there in the cold, coming off that water, and thought about how much beer it was going to take to get Wolfe out of his chair for this one. Because something told me this wasn't the kind of case that ends with a drifter's confession and everybody going home satisfied. Saints have secrets. That's usually why people build statues of them. It's easier to worship a story than to look too closely at the man. I made a few calls, took a few names, and drove back down through the covered bridge with the fading light turning that slow water the color of an old bruise. Somewhere behind me, in that boathouse, was a puzzle built by somebody who'd taken real care over how it would look to whoever found it. That kind of care doesn't come from a stranger passing through. It comes from somebody who knew exactly what story they wanted the body to tell. Bramble was at the window before I'd even cut the engine in front of the brownstone, that particular slow circle he does near the hall floor, the "someone's coming who matters" dance. And sure enough, 10 minutes later the bell rang. She gave her name as Marguerite Colfax, and Whistler did what Whistler does. Sat, considered her with that flat, unhurried stare of his, and after a long moment, leaned his head very gently against her knee. That's the good read, the rare one. I filed it away and took her coat. She was maybe 60, dressed like money that had learned not to advertise itself, and she sat in the red leather chair like she wasn't sure she deserved the comfort of it. She ran the Trust's scholarship committee, she told me, had known Corbin since before the Trust existed, and had come 200 miles because the county sheriff up in Black River wasn't going to look past the easiest answer, and somebody needed to make sure the truth got found, even if it wasn't convenient. He was the best man I ever knew, she said, and her voice didn't so much as catch, which told me either she'd made her peace with the grief already, or she hadn't let herself feel it yet. I brought her upstairs to the plant rooms myself, over her protests that she didn't want to interrupt anything, because Wolfe wasn't going to move before 4 o'clock for a king, and I wasn't about to pretend otherwise. He was standing over a Miltonia when we came in, scowling at an aphid like it had insulted his mother, and it took me mentioning the chess queen, just that detail, nothing else, to get his head to turn. A queen, he said, with no board, and set down his misting can with the particular deliberateness of a man who has just decided something is worth being annoyed about. He heard Mrs. Colfax out in the office 20 minutes later, beer in hand, eyes half shut, in that way that makes strangers think he's dozing, and makes me grateful I stopped being fooled by it years ago. She talked about the Trust, about scholarship funds and roof repairs, and Christmas baskets, about a man who'd apparently never had an unkind word said about him in 2 decades of running half a town's charity out of a converted mill office. "Nobody is universally beloved, Mrs. Colfax," Wolfe said when she finished, not unkindly. "Either your account is incomplete, or Mr. Corbin was extraordinarily careful." She didn't like that. Her jaw set, and for just a second, Whistler, curled by the desk, lifted his head and watched her the way he watches a door he's not sure should be opened. He was careful, she admitted finally. He had to be. Running money for a whole town makes you careful. Wolfe filed that the way he files everything worth filing, without comment, without expression, tucking it somewhere behind that vast, unbothered face of his, and told her Archie would be up to Black River within the week. She left looking like a woman who'd handed off a weight she'd been carrying a long way, which is a look I've learned not to trust completely. Black River wasn't big enough to hide people in, which made my job easier and everybody else's nerves worse. I started with the men who sat on the trust's board, 5 of them, and every single one had a version of grief that came with a catch in it somewhere. Harlan Voss, who owned the hardware store and half the buildings on Main Street, cried real tears over Corbin and then, not 30 seconds later, mentioned, a little too casually, that the trust's books were a private matter, best left with the accountants. A man doesn't pivot that fast from tears to defensiveness unless something's sitting under the grief like a stone under a rug. Dr. Priya Anand, the town's only physician for the better part of 15 years, told me Corbin had personally paid for her clinic's new roof after a storm, and her voice went thin and careful the moment I asked how the trust decided who got help and who didn't. "Elias decided," she said. Elias always decided. And there was something underneath those 2 sentences I couldn't yet name. Then there was Corbin's niece, Dana, 26 and sharp-eyed, in a way that made her stand out from everybody else in that town, like a lit match in a dark room. She didn't cry at all. She told me flatly that her uncle had cut off her college fund 2 years back, for reasons he never bothered explaining. And when I asked if that had made her angry, she looked at me like the question was beneath both of us. "Everyone in this town owed him something," she said. "That's not the same as loving him." The glove kept nagging at me. Small hands. I asked around discreetly, and got nothing but blank looks, which in a town this size either meant nobody knew whose it was, or everybody had decided together not to know. Whistler had ridden up with me, on Wolfe's orders. The dog's read of a stranger, Archie, has yet to fail either of us, and I brought him along on the door knocking, mostly for cover, and partly because I trusted his nose more than half these people's alibis. He gave Voss a slow, disinterested sniff and sat well back. He wouldn't go near Dana Corbin's porch at all, hackles up just slightly, though he settled the moment she stepped inside and shut the door. That wasn't proof of anything. Wolfe would have reminded me of that himself, but it was a thread, and threads are what you pull on until the whole sweater comes apart in your hands. By evening I had 5 suspects, a town full of quiet debts nobody wanted to discuss, and the growing uncomfortable sense that the saint of Black River had built his kingdom on something a lot more complicated than kindness. Sheriff Wade Purnell met me at the diner on Main Street with the confidence of a man who'd already closed the case in his own head and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. "Drifter," he said, before I'd finished ordering coffee. "We had 2 reported up near the county line the week before. One of them's got priors for theft. Corbin surprised him robbing the boathouse. There was a struggle, and that's your fishing line." I asked about the glove. He shrugged. "Probably Corbin's own, tucked in from some church rummage sale. Didn't mean a thing." I asked about the queen. He hadn't even bothered running that detail down. Called it some kid's toy that got carried in on somebody's shoe, which struck me as one of the more creative pieces of nonsense I'd heard in a professional capacity. I called Wolfe from the phone booth outside, and I could hear him set his beer down hard enough to matter. "A struggling drifter does not pause, mid-assault, to place a lady's glove tenderly into his victim's coat pocket," Wolfe said. "Nor does he leave a chess piece, an object requiring deliberate transport to the scene, clenched in a dead man's hand as a parting gift. Mr. Purnell has confused a convenient narrative for an investigated one. He's not going to like hearing that. I have no ambition to be liked by Mr. Purnell. I have some small ambition toward the truth, which is presently being smothered under the weight of his indifference." He paused. and I could practically hear him deciding whether the conversation warranted more beer. It apparently did. The drifter theory requires us to believe in three coincidences arriving at once, each independent of the others, each perfectly convenient. I do not believe in one such coincidence, Archie, let alone three stacked like firewood. He was right, and worse, I think Purnell half knew it too. There'd been something in the way he wouldn't meet my eyes over the ledger question, like a man reciting a script he hadn't written and didn't entirely believe. Whether that was laziness or a genuine wish not to look too hard at his beloved local saint, or something closer to the bone, I couldn't say yet. What I did know was that Purnell had never asked Voss why he flinched at the word accountants. Never asked Dr. Anand why Elias always decided came out of her like a confession. Never once wondered whose small, careful hand that glove belonged to, or why anybody would carry a lone chess piece to a murder. A theory that convenient, in a town this small, generally exists because somebody wants it to. I thanked the sheriff for his time, finished my coffee, and went looking for the one person in Black River who might tell me the truth, precisely because she had nothing left to protect. Dana Corbin ran a little bookshop 2 doors down from the diner, and she didn't look surprised to see me come back. "You didn't buy the drifter story either," she said, not quite a question, setting down the ledger she'd been working on. An ordinary shop ledger, not the waterlogged kind, though the sight of it made something in my chest tighten anyway. I asked her straight out about the college fund her uncle had cut off. She was quiet a moment, turning a paperback over in her hands like she was deciding how much to give me. 2 years ago, I found some paperwork in his study I wasn't supposed to see, she said finally. Old correspondence, names of people in town, amounts of money that didn't match anything in the trust's public books. She looked up. I asked him about it. He told me to forget I'd seen it, gave me some story about legal complexities, and a month later my tuition checks stopped. "You think he was punishing you for asking?" "I think," she said carefully, "that my uncle was very good at making people grateful to him, and grateful people don't ask questions." That was the flaw I'd been circling without naming. Every account I'd gathered painted Corbin's generosity as spontaneous, saintly, almost involuntary. But generosity that specific, that targeted, that perfectly timed to whatever a person needed most, isn't spontaneous. It's information. Somebody who knows exactly what you need most badly enough to solve it for you also knows, by definition, exactly what you're most afraid of losing. I pressed her on the correspondence. Could she remember any names? She hesitated, then gave me 2. Voss, and a name I didn't recognize. A woman named Celeste Fenn, who'd apparently left town not long after Corbin's help arrived. Voss again. That made twice his name had surfaced in places it had no obvious business being. I thanked Dana, and made a note to ask Wolfe whether generosity and leverage might, in the right saintly hands, be the same coin shown 2 different faces. Whistler, waiting by the shop door, gave Dana one last look on the way out. Not the wary sniff from before, but something closer to the sit and lean he'd given Mrs. Colfax. Whatever guard she'd been keeping up around me, some of it had come down in that conversation, and the dog had noticed before I fully had. I drove out to find Harlan Voss with the uncomfortable, sharpening sense that Black River's saint had built his church on something a lot closer to control than charity, and that somebody in this town had finally run out of gratitude. The drifter theory, thin as it was, got a second wind 2 days later, when Purnell's men found a battered wallet stuffed under the boathouse dock. No cash, a few scraps of ID, belonging to one Curtis Meade, the drifter with priors Purnell had already fixed his sights on. It was, I had to admit, a tidy little bow on an otherwise ugly package. Too tidy. I drove the wallet's location, the water stains on it, the way it had supposedly sat under that dock for a week without a single deputy noticing it during the initial search, straight up to Wolfe over the phone that evening. "Describe the water damage," he said. "Soaked through, leathers curled at the edges like it's been wet a long time, and yet discovered only now, after a search you tell me was thorough." A pause, and I heard the particular silence that meant he was turning something over slowly, the way he does with a difficult crossword. Water that has soaked a wallet for a week develops a particular character. Archie, mildew, a certain give in the stitching. Tell me plainly, did it smell of the river, or did it smell of tap water and time? I hadn't thought to smell a dead man's supposed murder weapon, which is exactly the kind of gap Wolfe exists to notice, and I exist to go back and fill. I drove back to the sheriff's office, made a nuisance of myself, and got 5 minutes alone with the evidence bag. The wallet smelled clean, faintly of dish soap if anything. Not river water, not a week's submersion. Somebody had wet that wallet recently, in a sink, and tucked it under the dock, hoping nobody would look too closely at anything but the ID inside. I told Purnell what I'd found. He didn't want to hear it. A fabricated trail undoes a closed case, and closed cases are a lot more comfortable than open ones in a town this size. But he couldn't argue with his own nose once I made him use it. Wolfe's assessment, delivered later over a beer he'd earned through sheer patience with my report, was characteristically blunt. Someone wished this case solved quickly, cleanly, and at Mr. Meade's expense. A man conveniently absent, conveniently unable to defend himself, and conveniently already known to your sheriff as a thief. That is not an accident of circumstance, Archie. That is a choice, made by someone with access to both the boathouse and a sink, which narrows it down to about everyone in town who's ever washed a dish. It narrows it, Wolfe said, to someone frightened enough of the truth to manufacture a lie this clumsy. Fear breeds haste, and haste breeds mistakes. We are fortunate in our killer's impatience. I wasn't sure fortunate was the word I'd have picked, standing in that boathouse a second time with the smell of dish soap still faintly in my nose. But I understood what he meant. Somebody in Black River was scared enough to frame an absent man rather than let the investigation breathe. And scared people, in my experience, are rarely the ones with nothing to hide. Wolfe's next instructions were, on their face, almost insultingly mundane. Find out what time Elias Corbin went to bed, not what time he died. What time he went to bed, on an ordinary night, and whether that Thursday had looked any different. I put the question to his housekeeper, a stout, no-nonsense woman named Eunice Pratt, who'd kept his cottage for 11 years, and she answered without hesitation, 10:30, sharp, every night, rain or shine, because Mr. Corbin believed a disordered schedule made for a disordered mind, except that Thursday. That Thursday he'd told her not to wait up, said he had a late errand, and sent her home by 8. An errand. At night. Alone. I asked whether he often took such errands. Eunice thought about it. A saint's housekeeper doesn't like admitting her saint kept irregular hours, and finally allowed that, yes, every few months, always alone, always unexplained, and always the following morning, he'd seem lighter, somehow, relieved, like a man who'd set something heavy down. I asked about visitors to the cottage, the ordinary boring traffic of daily life, and got a name that stopped me cold. A woman had come by twice in the past month, small, well-dressed, never gave a name, always let in through the side door, and never through the front. Eunice had assumed a private matter of the heart and hadn't pried. Small hands, a side door, a glove that fit no one in town. I called it in to Wolfe that evening, and he received the detail about the late errands, with the particular satisfaction of a man watching a stubborn lock finally give. A saint who conducts business by night, through side doors, with unnamed women who fit into small gloves, he said, is a saint whose ledger of good deeds may have an unpublished companion volume. Ask Mrs. Pratt whether Mr. Corbin ever received mail-addressed care of a post office box, rather than his home. He had. A box in the next county over, which Eunice had only ever seen him collect from personally, never sent it through her. That, Wolfe said, was the structural flaw laid bare at last. Not evidence of the crime's mechanics yet, but evidence of a second life, running quietly underneath the first, invisible to a town too grateful to look. A man doesn't keep a private post box and unannounced night visitors and irregular errands out of simple discretion. He keeps them because some part of his business cannot survive daylight. I drove back to the inn that night thinking about the word saint and how much weight it can be made to carry before it finally splits. The break-in at Voss's hardware store happened 2 nights later, and it threw my whole working theory sideways before I'd even had coffee. Somebody had gone through his back office with real purpose. Not the till, not the register, but a filing cabinet, papers scattered across the floor, one drawer pried open with something blunt. Voss himself looked genuinely rattled when I found him standing over the mess. More rattled than grief over a friend's murder had made him, which told me something in itself. What was in that cabinet? I asked. Business records, he said, too fast. Nothing that matters to your case. I didn't believe him, and neither, apparently, did whoever had broken in, because the one folder missing from an otherwise chaotic scene was labeled, according to what Voss reluctantly admitted, BRT correspondence, Black River Trust. Somebody had wanted whatever paper trail connected Voss to Corbin's charity badly enough to break a window for it. This wrecked the tidy little frame job with the wallet. If the case were as simple as a drifter's opportunistic robbery gone bad, there'd be no reason for anyone, 3 days later, to go digging through Voss's private files at 2 in the morning. Someone was still actively covering tracks. Someone who knew exactly what paper existed and exactly where to find it. I'd brought Bramble along on this trip too, at Wolfe's insistence that a second set of instincts costs us nothing and may cost the guilty everything, and he was the one who found it. Not the missing folder, which was long gone, but a single scrap of paper caught in the broken window's frame, where the intruder's coat had snagged it going through. Half a name torn clean across. Este Fenn. Celeste Fenn, the name Dana had given me. The woman who'd left town not long after Corbin's help arrived. I stood in that ransacked office with the scrap in my hand and felt the shape of the thing shift under me, the way a case does when you realize you've been looking at the picture upside down. This wasn't about protecting a saint's reputation from petty scandal. This was about something specific enough, and dangerous enough, that somebody was willing to commit a second crime rather than let it surface. I called Wolfe that night with the scrap of paper and the name, and for once he didn't reach for the beer before he answered. "Find Celeste Fenn, Archie," he said. "I begin to suspect Mr. Corbin's sainthood was rather more expensive to maintain than his admirers understood." It took 2 days and a favor from a records clerk in the next county to run Celeste Fenn to ground, and when I found her, waiting tables at a diner 40 miles from Black River, going by her middle name now, she didn't want to talk at all until I mentioned Corbin was dead. Then she sat down across from me in her own diner, on her own break, and told me everything, quiet and flat, like a woman reciting something she'd rehearsed in her head 1,000 times, waiting for someone to finally ask. 6 years ago, she said, she'd made a mistake, a small embezzlement from a previous employer, desperate and stupid and born out of a sick child's hospital bills. And Corbin had found out about it before anyone else did. He hadn't turned her in. He'd offered to make it disappear, quietly, for her eternal gratitude and a modest, ongoing contribution to the trust, deducted from what wages she had left. For 6 years. He called it charity, she said, and her voice cracked for the first time. He called it helping. He'd tell me how lucky I was that a man like him cared enough to protect me. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the whole architecture of Black River's saint reassemble itself into something uglier and far more coherent. This wasn't isolated. Voss's flinch at accountants, Dr. Anand's careful. Elias always decided. Dana's cut off tuition the moment she asked one question too many. A saint who solved people's worst problems in exchange for permanent, silent leverage. Charity as a leash. Generosity as a debt that never came due. "Did he ever threaten you outright?" I asked. "Never had to," she said. "He just reminded me what he knew. That was always enough." The core mechanics of the crime clicked into place the moment I relayed it all to Wolfe that evening. Not who had killed Corbin, not yet, but how such a killing could happen at all, beneath a town's collective gratitude. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't even, strictly, revenge. It was the desperate act of someone Corbin had quietly owned for years, someone who'd finally been pushed to a place where exposure and violence looked like the same door. "The glove," Wolfe said slowly, "belongs to someone small enough, careful enough, and desperate enough to have visited him by the side door more than once. The chess piece and the torn ledger page are not clues left carelessly, Archie. They are a message, deliberately staged by someone who wanted the crime seen, even if not yet understood." "Seen by who?" "That," Wolfe said, "is what Section 10 exists to conceal until we are ready to use it." Wolfe went quiet after that. The particular quiet that meant he already had the shape of the thing and was simply waiting for me to bring him enough names to fill it in. I hated that quiet. I always have. It meant long days of watching people's faces for a tell they didn't know they were giving, while Wolfe sat in his brownstone, letting a fact settle like sediment until the water above it went clear. He had me go back to Black River and simply watch for a few days. No direct questions, no confrontations, just presence. Sit in the diner, walk past the shops, let people get used to me being there, and, inevitably, get a little too comfortable saying things in front of a stranger they'd stopped noticing. It worked better than I expected. Dr. Anand, over coffee she hadn't offered to buy me, mentioned almost in passing that Corbin had helped her cover a malpractice scare early in her career. Quietly, generously, and permanently. Voss, 3 drinks into an evening at the one bar in town, admitted that his hardware store's books had some creative arrangements that Corbin had structured for him personally. Arrangements that would ruin him if anyone official ever looked too closely. Everyone, it turned out, had a debt. Everyone had a secret Corbin had personally solved, and personally, quietly, held over them ever since. The benevolent trust wasn't a charity with a leak in it. The leak was the charity, its actual engine, running underneath the public one, converting other people's desperation into permanent loyalty. I relayed all of it to Wolfe, and he received each new name, Voss, Anand, half a dozen others, with the same unhurried attention, filing them without comment. And it was starting to unnerve me how patient he was being about a killer's identity that felt, to me, like it could be almost anyone in that town. "You know who did it?" I said finally on the phone. More accusation than question. "I have a strong theory," Wolfe admitted. "I withhold it because a theory announced too early invites either flight or a second, more thorough murder, of a witness or of evidence we have not yet secured. Patience, Archie, is not cruelty. It is simply arithmetic performed correctly. And if you're wrong, then Black River will have 1 saint's worth of secrets exposed for nothing, and I will owe you a rather better bottle of wine than usual." A pause, dry as ever. "I do not intend to be wrong." I hung up more frustrated than reassured. But I'd learned a long time ago that Wolfe's silences, however maddening, were rarely idle. Somewhere in that pile of names and debts was the one person whose fear had finally curdled into violence. And Wolfe, sitting in his plant rooms 200 miles away, already knew which one. The chess queen finally made sense over, of all things, a conversation about Corbin's evenings. I'd gone back to Eunice Pratt, the housekeeper, this time asking about the cottage's contents rather than its comings and goings. And she mentioned, almost as an aside, dusting a shelf while she talked, that Mr. Corbin used to play chess by mail. Correspondence chess, a hobby from decades back, trading postcards with moves written on them with old friends scattered across the country. He hadn't played in years, she said, not since his last regular partner had passed. But he'd kept the set, a beautiful old ivory set, a gift, sitting untouched in his study. I asked to see it. The set was there, exactly as she'd described, except for one piece missing, the White Queen. It clicked into place with an almost physical sensation, standing in that quiet study. The Queen in Corbin's dead fist wasn't a stranger's calling card, or a random object carried to the scene by chance. It came from his own house. Someone had taken it from his study, carried it down to the boathouse, and pressed it into his hand. Or he'd been holding it himself when he died, taken from his own desk during whatever conversation preceded his death. A queen, the most powerful piece on the board, taken by someone who felt, perhaps, that they'd finally found a way to move against a man who'd controlled every square for years. I called Dana Corbin, since she'd have known the cottage's contents better than most, and asked if she recognized the significance of chess to her uncle. She went quiet a long moment. "He used to say the Queen was the only piece that could do anything," she said finally. "Everyone else was stuck moving one way. He liked that about her. He used to say it like it meant something about him. A vain little detail, but a telling one. A man who saw himself as the Queen on his own board, the only piece with real freedom of movement. Everyone else constrained by rules he'd quietly written for them." I reported it all to Wolfe, and for the first time in days, I heard something almost like satisfaction in his voice. "The Queen was not planted as a clue for us, Archie," he said. "I suspect it was never meant to be found by anyone but Corbin himself, in his final moment. A message from someone who wished him to understand, precisely, what was happening and why. Taken from his own game, pressed into his own hand. A queen, finally, moved against its king. You're saying the killer wanted him to understand before he died?" "I am saying," Wolfe said, "that this was never a crime of panic, Archie. It was a crime of long-rehearsed intention, dressed to look like chaos." Wolfe's instructions arrived by phone 2 days later, precise as a chess move themselves. "Gather the board members and the household staff at the Trust's hall on Friday evening. Tell them it concerned clarifying the Trust's finances going forward, and make sure Dana Corbin, Harlan Voss, and Dr. Anand were all present without fail." The bait itself was simple and cruel in its precision. I was to announce, on Wolfe's behalf, that Corbin's private files, including his personal correspondence file, specifically noted as recovered from a post office box in the next county, had been located and were being reviewed by an outside auditor before the estate settled. A lie, mostly. Wolfe hadn't recovered anything of the sort, but the announcement itself was the trap. Someone in that room, Wolfe told me over the phone that morning, has spent the better part of 2 weeks trying to destroy or steal precisely such a file. Announce its recovery, and watch which face fails to remain composed. I stood at the front of that half-lit hall Friday evening and delivered the line as flatly as I could manage, watching the room the whole time the way Whistler watches a stranger at the door. Voss went pale, but Voss had gone pale at every mention of records since the break-in, and I'd already half-crossed him off my private list. A man scared of exposure, not necessarily a killer, and Bramble's disinterested sniff of him weeks back had never sat quite right for guilt. Dr. Anand's hands tightened around her coffee cup, but her face stayed composed, practiced, a doctor's calm holding under pressure the way it's trained to. It was Eunice Pratt, the housekeeper, standing quietly near the back with the household staff, a woman I'd barely considered as anything but a source of domestic detail, who went perfectly, unnaturally still. Not pale, not shaking. Still, in the specific way a person goes still when they are running calculations very fast behind an otherwise motionless face. I didn't react. Wolfe had been explicit. No confrontation tonight, only observation. But I caught her eye for half a second on my way out, and something passed there that I'd remember for a long time afterward. Not guilt exactly, not yet, but the recognition of a woman who understood, suddenly and completely, that the ground under her had just shifted. I called Wolfe from the inn that night and told him what I'd seen. "Eunice Pratt," he repeated, slowly, like he was turning the name over to check its weight. "Small hands, Archie. A woman with unrestricted, unremarked access to that cottage, to that study, to that chess set, for 11 years. A pause. Send word to Purnell that I expect his presence Sunday evening. And Archie, watch her closely between now and then. Bait, once taken, has a way of making the desperate reckless." I didn't have to watch Eunice Pratt closely for long, because she made her move the very next night. I'd taken a room at the inn close enough to the cottage that I could see its lights, more out of habit than any real plan. And it was Bramble, who I'd brought along again, more for company on a long stakeout than strategy, who caught it first. Around 11, he came up off the floor of the car in one motion, that low, focused stillness he gets right before he alerts, staring hard at the cottage's side door. A light went on inside, then off. A shape moved past the study window. I gave it a few minutes, then crossed the road on foot, quiet as I could manage, and found the side door. The same side door Eunice always used, the same one Corbin's mystery visitors had come through, standing very slightly ajar. Inside, by the thin beam of a shielded flashlight, Eunice Pratt was going through the study's desk with the fast, graceless urgency of someone who has stopped being careful because caution has already failed them. Papers scattered across the floor, a drawer pulled clean out, and in her other hand, already half into her coat pocket, a small bundle of letters tied with string that I'd have bet the brownstone itself were the correspondence Wolfe had invented out of thin air 2 days before. She hadn't found real evidence to destroy, because there wasn't any left to find at the cottage. Wolfe's bait had worked exactly as intended. driving her to search for something that existed only in the story I'd told. But the letters in her hand were real enough, whatever they were, and her presence there, at midnight, breaking into a dead man's desk, was answer enough to any question I still had left. I didn't rush her. I've learned that much from Wolfe over the years. A cornered person with nothing left to lose is more dangerous than one who still believes she has an escape route. I stood very still in the doorway and let Bramble's low growl announce me before I said a word. She turned, and in that thin flashlight beam her face wasn't guilty so much as exhausted. The face of someone who has been holding a single terrible weight upright for so long that the prospect of finally setting it down, even into an arrest, looked almost like relief. "I wasn't going to hurt anyone else," she said, before I'd even asked a single question. "I just needed the letters back, that's all I ever wanted, just to make it stop," I told her, as gently as I've ever told anyone anything in this line of work, that she was going to need to come with me to talk to a man in New York, and that whatever she'd needed to make stop, it had already, one way or another, come to an end. I didn't arrest her myself. That was never my job, and Wolfe wouldn't have wanted the mess of it done outside his own carefully staged reveal. But I did the next best thing. I sat with her in the cottage's small kitchen, made her a cup of coffee neither of us drank, and kept her talking quietly until dawn, without letting a single word of it slip into confession or accusation. She told me about her son. That was the shape of it, in the end, the way it so often is. A boy, grown now, gone wrong in his 20s with debts to people considerably less patient than a small-town philanthropist. Corbin had paid those debts off quietly, generously, the way he did everything, and had then made sure Eunice understood, in his gentle, unhurried way, that her employment, her son's safety, and her own long-buried silence about certain things she'd overheard through that cottage's thin walls over 11 years were now permanently, comfortably linked. "He never raised his voice," she said, staring into the coffee she wasn't drinking. "He didn't have to. He just reminded me, every few months, how lucky my boy was, how lucky I was, until I couldn't hear the word lucky anymore without wanting to scream." The letters in her coat, it turned out, were nothing to do with any real embezzlement scheme. They were her own, a decade of correspondence between her and Corbin, documenting the arrangement in his own careful, saintly language, papering even his cruelty in the vocabulary of kindness. She'd wanted them destroyed the moment she thought an outside auditor might read them and understand, at last, what the Saint of Black River had actually been running underneath his roof repairs and Christmas baskets. I called Purnell at first light, and I called Wolfe not long after. He listened to my full report without interruption, a rare enough event that I nearly asked if the line had dropped, and when he finally spoke, his voice had that particular weight it gets when a case has stopped being an intellectual exercise and started being simply sad. "Bring her to New York, Archie, gently as the law allows," he said, "and bring Mr. Purnell and Mrs. Colfax and whichever of the board members you deem essential. I intend to finish this properly, in my own office, where a town's illusions can be dismantled without a mob forming to defend them." I did as he asked, though the drive back down through that covered bridge felt longer than it had going up. Eunice Pratt, silent in the back seat, Bramble uncharacteristically still and watchful beside her the whole way, as if he understood better than most people would that the woman beside him wasn't dangerous anymore, only finally, terribly free. Wolfe's office that Sunday evening held more people than I'd ever seen crowded into it at once. Purnell, stiff and unhappy in his good uniform. Mrs. Colfax, hands folded tight in her lap. Voss, Dr. Anand, Dana Corbin, and Eunice Pratt herself, seated apart from the others at Wolfe's specific instruction, not as a suspect paraded for effect, but, he'd told me privately, as a woman entitled to hear her own story told accurately, rather than through the county's rumor mill. Wolfe took his time, as he always does, letting the beer settle and the silence stretch before he spoke. "Elias Corbin," he began, "was, by any measure you care to apply, a genuinely effective philanthropist. Roofs were repaired. Scholarships were funded. This is not in dispute, and I do not intend to dispute it. What is equally true, and considerably less comfortable, is that Mr. Corbin discovered early in his career that a man who solves people's most desperate, most shameful problems acquires, in the solving, a permanent claim upon them, one considerably more durable than gratitude alone. He walked them through it methodically. Celeste Fenn's embezzlement quietly buried in exchange for years of silent payments. Voss's creative books, structured by Corbin himself, held ever after as leverage. Dr. Anand's early malpractice scare, resolved and remembered. Dana's tuition, cut the moment she asked one question too pointed about her uncle's private correspondence. And, at the center of it, Eunice Pratt, 11 years of quiet service, purchased at the price of her son's safety and her own permanent silence. Each of these arrangements, individually, might be mistaken for kindness, Wolfe said. Collectively, they describe a system, a private ledger of debts owed not in money, but in obedience, administered by a man the entire town had been taught to call a saint. Mrs. Pratt's torn ledger page, recovered from the boathouse, was in fact a page from that private accounting, proof, had it survived intact, of precisely this arrangement, which is why it was torn free before the rest of the book could be properly examined. He turned, finally, to the mechanics of the death itself. Mr. Corbin summoned Mrs. Pratt to the boathouse that Thursday night, not the reverse, intending, we may reasonably infer, to renegotiate or renew the terms of her silence, as he had done every few months for over a decade. She brought with her, we know now, a single glove, an old habit of discretion around that side door, kept from years of unremarked comings and goings, and she brought, taken quietly from his own study earlier that week without any clear plan for its use, the white queen from his abandoned chess set. "Why the queen?" Purnell asked, gruff, clearly wanting the mechanics without the poetry. "Because," Wolfe said. Mrs. Pratt understood, perhaps without fully articulating it even to herself, precisely what that piece meant to him. The only piece on the board, in his own words, capable of moving freely, while everyone else remained constrained. She placed it in his hand, I believe, so that in his final moment he might understand exactly what had finally moved against him. The room had gone very quiet by the time Wolfe finished the central mechanics, and he let that silence sit a moment before turning to the smaller, tangled lies that had made my week in Black River so much harder than it needed to be. "Mr. Voss," he said, and Harlan Voss straightened like a man expecting a blow. "Your panic upon my inquiries was not the panic of a killer. It was the panic of a man terrified that his own compromised books, arranged for him by Mr. Corbin some years ago, would surface in any thorough investigation and ruin him, regardless of his innocence in the murder itself. Your break-in, orchestrated I believe entirely by yourself, in a clumsy attempt to retrieve your own incriminating file before Archie's inquiries went further, was foolish, and very possibly criminal in its own small way, but it was not homicide." Voss's shoulders dropped, some mixture of relief and shame passing over his face at once. "Dr. Anand, your composure under my associate's questioning was the composure of long practice at concealing an old professional fear, not the composure of guilt over a killing. Your debt to Mr. Corbin was real. Your gratitude, twisted slowly into obligation over years, was real. But you did not kill him, and I suspect some part of you has spent this past week almost hoping someone would prove you had, simply to be free of the arrangement at last." She didn't deny it, only looked down at her hands. "Miss Corbin," Wolfe continued, and Dana lifted her chin to meet him, "your anger toward your uncle was entirely justified and entirely irrelevant to his death. He cut off your tuition, not from cruelty in the abstract, but because your questions about his private correspondence threatened to expose an arrangement he could not afford exposed. You were, in your way, closer to the truth 2 years ago than anyone else in this town, and he punished you for it, exactly as he had learned to punish anyone who looked too closely. And the wallet," I put in, since it had been nagging at me the whole drive down, "the fabricated frame-up on the drifter, that," Wolfe said, "was Mrs. Pratt's own doing, in the days following the killing. A hasty, poorly considered attempt to close the investigation quickly, before its natural course could lead back to her. It was, I confess, the one genuinely amateurish element of an otherwise carefully planned confrontation, and it is precisely the kind of mistake fear produces in an otherwise careful person." Eunice, seated apart from the others, didn't argue any of it. She'd stopped, somewhere in the drive down from Black River, trying to defend the shape of what she'd done, only, it seemed, wanting it understood correctly, in full, rather than reduced to the county's easiest version of a desperate woman and a dead saint. Nobody in that office looked triumphant when Wolfe finished, least of all Wolfe himself. "I want to be precise about something," he said, into the heavy quiet that followed, "because I have watched this town, through Archie's reports, spend 2 weeks either defending a dead man's sainthood or quietly, guiltily, wondering whether they deserve to keep believing in it. Mr. Corbin's charitable works were genuine. The roofs he repaired kept out genuine rain. The scholarships he funded sent genuine children to genuine schools. I do not ask you to discard that truth." He paused, and when he continued, something in his voice had gone unusually gentle. "For him. But a man may do considerable good in the world while simultaneously extracting, from the very people he has helped, a price they were never permitted to refuse. That is not philanthropy corrupted by a single flaw. That is control, wearing philanthropy's clothing so convincingly that even its victims struggled to name what was being done to them. Mrs. Pratt did not kill a saint, whatever this town chooses to believe going forward. She killed a man who had spent 11 years quietly threatening the one thing she could not bear to lose, and who summoned her that night, by all available evidence, to renew that threat once more. Purnell shifted, uncomfortable in the way of a man whose job requires clean categories, and had just been handed a case with none. "That doesn't make it not murder," he said. "It does not," Wolfe agreed. "The law will, quite properly, treat it as murder, and Mrs. Pratt will answer for it accordingly. I make no argument for her innocence under the law. I make only the observation that justice, properly understood, requires knowing the whole shape of what happened, not merely which hand held the fishing line, but which hand had, for over a decade, held something considerably more binding over hers." Eunice sat very still through all of it, and when it was finally her turn to speak, she said only, quietly, that she was glad, at least, that her boy would hear the truth of it eventually, rather than a stranger's cruel simplification. Small comfort against what was coming, but comfort in that room all the same. Mrs. Colfax left first, pale and shaken, the image of her beloved saint permanently altered in a way I suspected would take her considerably longer than a car ride home to fully absorb. Purnell took Eunice into custody with unusual gentleness, for him, and the rest filed out in the particular hush of people who'd come looking for a villain and left instead with something far harder to carry. An ordinary, ruined, sympathetic tragedy, wearing a murder's clothes. I closed the office door behind the last of them and found Wolfe already back in his chair, beer in hand, looking, for once, more tired than satisfied. "You didn't enjoy that one," I said. "Enjoyment," he said, "was never a reasonable expectation for this case. Satisfaction, perhaps, in having reached the truth accurately, but there is very little pleasure to be found in unmasking a man's charity as a leash, or in watching a woman who spent 11 years protecting her son finally lose the only life she'd built around that protection." I poured myself something a good deal stronger than beer and sat down across from him, and for a while neither of us said much of anything. Outside, I could hear the ordinary evening sounds of the brownstone settling into itself, Fritz moving around the kitchen below, the particular quiet of a case finally, properly closed. "Black River will go on," Wolfe said eventually, more to himself than to me. "Someone will take up the trust's work. One hopes with rather less appetite for private ledgers. The roofs that needed fixing will still get fixed. That is, I suppose, the small, complicated mercy in all of this. That Mr. Corbin's genuine good does not simply evaporate because his methods are now understood. It exists alongside the harm uncomfortably, the way most human legacies do. Not the tidy ending Mrs. Colfax was hoping for. Very few true endings are tidy, Archie. That distinction belongs almost exclusively to the false ones, the drifters, the convenient wallets, the theories that let a town keep its illusions intact. He set down his empty glass with the small final click that, in this house, always means the day is done. I find I have very little further to say about saints tonight. I believe I shall return to something considerably more honest about its own nature. The Miltonias, I suspect, have been neglected in all this. He rose, and by the door Bramble had already resettled into his customary spot near the window, nose to the glass, watching the street the way he always does when a case has finally closed and the world outside has gone back to being merely ordinary. Whistler, a few feet away, curled by my desk, with the particular loose contentment of a dog who'd done his job and knew it. I sat a while longer with my drink, thinking about queens that move freely, while everyone else stays boxed in by somebody else's rules, and how long it can take a town, or a person, to notice they've been playing on somebody else's board the whole time. Then I got up, turned off the lights, and left the house to its dogs and its quiet, the way every case here eventually ends.